the lake as smooth as a mirror. Tranquility. The question that we're asking now of purpose is a little bit deeper. It's not about what we're doing. It's about what we are feeling as we are doing, what we are feeling, happiness. And we went through kind of some of the philosophers' definitions of happiness, which tended to focus on the externals, that we want something out there, we get that something out there, that want or that need or that desire, if you want to call it that, is then satiated or fulfilled, and we recognize that state of fulfillment as happiness. So the idea then is that perfect happiness or total happiness from that philosophical point of view would be that all of our desires are instantly filled. We lack nothing. And of course, this kind of spilled over into Sunday school lessons, things that I was taught and perhaps others was taught as a child, that when we die, we go to heaven, and in this place called heaven, all of your wants are immediately fulfilled. So basically, heaven became a place that was totally opposite of earth. Here on earth, we struggle, we suffer, we have lack and limitation and all those other experiences. But once we get to heaven, like the song says, when we get up to heaven, we're going to put on our shoes. When we get up to heaven, everything is going to be taken care of. So the philosophers argued then that happiness in and of itself could not be a primary purpose in life. And the reason for it was that it was so diverse amongst people, that what one person wants for happiness, another person may not. In fact, it may make another person unhappy. So the philosophers argued amongst themselves then that, well, happiness itself couldn't be a prime motivator, the ultimate good, they called it, the ultimate good, the ultimate driver of life. But spiritual teachers give us a different point of view. So the Dalai Lama, specifically in his book, The Art of Happiness, was asked by a Western psychiatrist what he thought the purpose of life was, and the Dalai Lama replied, the purpose of life is to be happy, that is what everybody is seeking, happiness. Now we are each seeking it perhaps in a different way, but ultimately what we want is this obscure, this nebulous thing called happiness. And that if we move towards that, if we move towards this desire to be happy, see, then what we are doing is we are growing spiritually. If I flip back to the question then of, well, what is our purpose in life, and look at it from a spiritual point of view, remember I told you as a child we were taught, well, God made us to know God, to love God, to serve God, and to be happy with God for eternity. And that was a beautiful, beautiful definition to accept as a child, to understand as a child. And now, as an adult, we could look back on it and say, well, what is our purpose in life? And the mystics would tell us, well, our purpose in life is to discover and reveal the divinity within, the life of the divine that created us within. Our purpose is to give the light, or to allow the divine to experience the delight of living life through us and as us. Almost the same thing said in different terms, We are here to discover our true spiritual nature and to express that true spiritual nature. And that expression is an expression of joy, an expression of delight. Because the divine does not need anything. See, it does not act out of need as you and I do. We go to work because we need money to pay the bills, to buy the food and things like that. So if you ask people, is your delight going to work? They say, no, I go to work because I don't have a choice, you see. Now that's a mindset. We have to understand that that's a mindset. We could just as easily go to work because we enjoy going to work. Right? It's the difference of the way that we look at it. So the divine does not create out of a sense of want or lack or need. It is everything, it has everything, it doesn't need anything. Why then does it create? And the mystical philosophers, the spiritual philosophers, would say it creates out of a sense of joy, out of a sense of delight. It creates to enjoy its creation. It creates to take delight in experiencing itself as that creation. And then that comes to us and say, well, it created us out of itself to take delight in us awakening to its presence within us, in us discovering it, and then in us learning how to let it live as us, let it live through us. This is kind of the diminishing of the ego self, the human ego, the sense of I that is separated from everything. And it is the emergence, or perhaps a better term is the transcendence of that ego self into something that is inclusive. Instead of coming from a place of separation and difference and apartness and all of those things. It is an experience of self with a big S, capital S, experience of the self that unites with everything, that identifies with everything, does not exclude, it includes. So the definition of happiness then that we came to with the Dalai Lama was different than the one that the Western philosophers gave us. It is not a happiness that occurs when our needs are satisfied by some external means, right? Because that is never going to be complete. It is always, at best, going to be a temporary situation. Right? So we're hungry and we eat, and then we get hungry again. Then we're thirsty and we drink and we get thirsty again. And this is why I believe in the New Testament we have a passage in there where Jesus is talking to the woman at the well. And he says the Father is a spirit and has to be worshipped in spirit, has to be understood in terms of the spirit. And if you drink the water from the well, you'll get thirsty again. But if you drink the water that I have to give you, you will never be thirsty again. Of course, to our intellect, this doesn't make sense. Of course, our body's going to need more water sooner or later. But in speaking of spiritual terms of equanimity, of contentment, of satisfaction, you see, when we recognize that presence of the divine within us, the Christ within us, and we live it, or we let it live as us, you see, then this sense of lack, this sense of need, this sense of want, it's reduced and eventually eliminated. So we came then to this idea of happiness as being this equanimity, this contentment, this undisturbed, peaceful mind. The lake is smooth as glass that the book of Revelation talks about. And I use the example of an ocean, that there may be disturbances at the surface of the ocean. There may be a storm whipping up the waves and all of those things. But down below, it's perfectly calm. Down below, it's perfectly calm. So, excuse me, pollen is high here today. Causing a little bit of gravel in my throat. So as we start to develop into this equanimity, into this peacefulness, into this tranquility, disturbances will still come into our life. You know, we want to be clear about that. We're not saying, well, you know, we're just never going to experience anything upsetting ever again. But it doesn't stay with us. You see, it doesn't stay with us very long, because we are perhaps grounded is a term. We are grounded in the peace that is our true nature. So if we accept then this definition that the happiness is this tranquility, is this contentment, is this peacefulness, is this peace that passes understanding, and our purpose in life is to experience that and live in that as much as we possibly can, then what I think we're seeing is that is kind of like a pointer, a compass pointer, to what we need to do for our spiritual growth. Because this definition of happiness and this definition of experiencing the presence of the divine within, they kind of mesh hand in hand, because when we experience the presence of the divine within, when we have that mystical union, if we wish to call it that, see, then we are at peace. Then we are tranquil. So, excuse me again. So the Dalai Lama says, happiness is what we're seeking. We are all seeking that. All sentient beings are seeking that, not just you and I and the people on the conference bridge, but all sentient beings are seeking that. We are all alike in this manner. It is as if we have been born and we have been given this desire for happiness, knowing that it will lead us to the divine within. Remember the story that comes from the East, that when the gods created men, they wanted to keep the greatest secret from mankind, and they had a discussion of where to hide it. And no matter where they came up with trying to hide it, they figured that humans would eventually find it. So then they decided to hide it the one place that humans wouldn't look, which was within them. So we have this desire. We have this desire for happiness, and it is a good desire. Now, philosophers have said, no, it's a selfish desire. You shouldn't have the desire to be happiness. Happiness is something that occurs when you do all the right things. When you obey the rules, you'll be happy. But you shouldn't obey the rules in order to be happy, because wanting to be happy is selfish. You should just obey the rules because obeying the rules is the right thing to do. Kant says happiness is a consequence of doing your duty. And I would have to ask, well, where did he come up with that? Why is doing our duty the primary thing that we should do, you see? So I think it's much simpler than that. There is a desire within each and every one of us to be happy, and if we follow that desire, well, certainly we will make mistakes along the way. We will go down rat holes, and we will look places and say, oh, this will make me happy, and oh, that'll make me happy. And we will find that no, that there is emptiness down there. That is part of the experience of growing and maturing. It's like the theme from Midnight Cowboy, looking for love in all the wrong places. We do that. That's part of the human experience. And we can't beat ourselves up too much for doing that, because we are seeking. We are being driven to seek, if you want to think of it that way. And eventually, we will figure it out. Eventually, we will find it. So this idea then of true happiness is not happiness at somebody else's expense. It is not a selfish happiness in that I want something for me and for nobody else. But it is contentment. It is equanimity. It is peace. And I truly want that for all people. All people. I believe all people are seeking that. And I truly, truly hope that they find that. And I would withhold true happiness from no one. True happiness. I would withhold it from no person. Emerson says if we offer a prayer and we are praying for something that we would not want for everyone, it is not a good prayer. It is not a good prayer. If we want something, we want a particular experience of happiness, and we do not wish all other persons happiness, then our desire is a selfish desire, see? And I think that's what the philosophers were talking about, and perhaps they did not have the experience of the unselfish desire, the equanimity, the peace that we were talking about. I don't know, but it's possible that their experience just did not allow them to see that. So now we kind of arrive at a point where we can say, all right, well, so happiness is the thing that we are seeking. And how do we do it? How do we get there? And the Dalai Lama says you do it by training your mind. But not just the conscious part of mind, not the intellect part of mind, not logic, not reason. Certainly they're included, but they are not exclusive, because in this definition of mind, it includes that part of consciousness below our conscious awareness. Subliminal is the best description we can come up with, right? There are things that we know and we don't know that we know. You know, there is, as Carl Jung would say, there's like this other self within us. We have the ego self that we are aware of, but then we have this whole other self, this subliminal self or subconscious self or unconscious self. Different times they called it the same by different terms, but the same thing. But it is conscious, it is aware, it does act, and it motivates much of our behavior. And yet our conscious mind does not know it directly. We know it from what it does, and we know it from its symbols, but we don't know it directly. We can't have a conversation with it and talk to it. And yet here we are, almost as if we are at least two different people in the same experience. So the Dalai Lama says, if we learn to train our mind, we can experience this happiness. And where we left off last week, I said, because in our mind, or in this thing called mind, that is where we experience happiness, and that is where we experience unhappiness. You could take the same thing, and you can give it to two different people, and one person will be happy and the other will be unhappy. The external stimulus is exactly the same, you know. You give two people an ice cream cone, and one says, oh good, an ice cream cone, I love ice cream. And another person says, I hate that flavor ice cream. I don't want that flavor, I want a different flavor ice cream. Same thing, same thing. And where does this difference take place? It takes place in our consciousness, in our mind. So the Dalai Lama is using mind as both the conscious awareness and feeling nature. Dr. Holmes in the textbook tells us that consciousness is thought plus feeling. Not just what you're thinking, but you must be feeling it as well. He said, now an intellectual treatment or affirmative prayer can get results, but one that is propelled by our feeling nature gets even better results. Another way to put it is when your head and your heart are aligned, you see, that's happiness, that's happiness. So now we're at the point where we say, okay, so this thing called happiness, and this is what we are seeking, or it is a good thing to seek. We can make it our purpose to seek happiness. We understand we're not talking about selfish happiness. We are talking about tranquility, peace, equanimity. We can get there by training our mind. If we accept all of those premises up until there, then the question is, well, what tools do we have to do that? You see, you know, if I wanted to go out in the garage and work on the car, you know, I would roll my toolbox over to it, and I'd have hammers and screwdrivers and pliers and all of the appropriate tools to work on the car. Usually I'm missing one and I have to go to the store, but mostly I'd have the appropriate tools to work on the car. So now what are the tools? What are the tools that we have to work on training our minds? See? What are the tools that we have? We have practices, we have spiritual practices that we can engage in. But we must come back to the very, very basics that we are talking about here. What is it that makes us as human beings unique amongst other creatures on this planet? And as far as we know, it is self-awareness, right? We have the ability to be aware of not only ourself as a unique, individualized expression of this life, but we can be aware of what we are thinking, and we can be aware of what we are feeling. Now, we don't always do that. In fact, we do it very little, but we have that ability. We have the ability to choose. We have will and we have volition, and we can choose that which we wish to give our attention to. So we can set our intention. Right? In our opening treatment, I said, let's set our intention to be happy. We can set our intention to be happy, and then we can be aware. We can be aware of whether or not we are happy. And if we are not, then we can choose to change the focus of whatever it is that we are experiencing as unhappiness. We can change our mind. Right? Emmett Fox said the key to scientific prayer, which is what he called treatment, scientific prayer, the key to scientific prayer is to change your mind and keep it changed. He said, if you have a problem, what you want to do is turn completely away from the problem and turn entirely towards God. Now this implies that we have some ability to control what we give our attention to control that. But the problem is twofold. First is we are usually not aware. We are usually not aware of what we are thinking, what we are feeling, what's going on around us. Our mind is off someplace else. We're eating our breakfast, and while we're eating our breakfast, we are thinking about work. Or we are thinking about the drive to work. Or how's the traffic this morning? Or maybe we need to turn on the radio and listen to the traffic report. And we are never fully present in the moment. Our mind is someplace else. Or our mind is off in the past, redoing something that's already done, rehashing an argument that way, well, I wish I would have said this, you know, all of those kind of things. And when we're doing that, we're not aware of what's going on now. We're not fully present in the moment. This is where we were talking about the practice of mindfulness. Can you be fully present in the moment? Can you be here now? There's a book, I think that's John Kabat-Zinn's book, Be Here Now. Maybe not, but there is a book by that title. I just don't know who Zinn wrote it. Sounds like something he would write. So we have to be aware. We have to start with awareness, and then we have to be able to change the focus. We have to be able to change the focus. And many people I talk to when they first come into this teaching will say, well, I have no choice. I can't control my mind. How, you tell me not to worry. How can I stop worrying? You know, every time I try to stop worrying, I worry more, you know. Which is the whole point, that you can't not think of the thing. You can't not think of it, right? So from the Middle East, we get the parable of the sultan who called people to the palace and said that one of them would be able to win this palace. Going to have a contest, and one of them would be able to win this palace. All they had to do to win the palace was to stay there for one night and not think of a white elephant. And of course, no one could do it, because the more they tried to not think of the white elephant, the more they were thinking of the white elephant. But this is where training the mind comes in, training the mind. Emmett Fox is one of my favorite authors, favorite teachers, and he was a pastor of the First Church of Divine Science in New York City. And of course, New York is special to me. I grew up there. I was born there and I grew up there, lived there for the first 20 years of my life. And Emmett Fox was giving a Sunday talk on this very topic one time. And he said to the people, he said, you know, he said, I went to Paris once. He says that in Paris they have this magnificent structure there. It's called the Eiffel Tower. And he went into intricate detail, and he started to explain how the Eiffel Tower was built. He started to explain how the elevators worked, and they used water ballast to move the elevators back and forth. And he went on to explain the views from the top of the Eiffel Tower and all of these things. And he had the entire audience engrossed in his description of the Eiffel Tower. He said, okay, now everybody just stop thinking about the Eiffel Tower. And he went on with his talk for a little while. And he stopped and he said, has everybody stopped thinking about the Eiffel Tower? You know, of course, everybody chuckled because they still had the Eiffel Tower in their mind. He said, oh, okay. And he went on with his talk a little bit. He said, you know, in New York Harbor, he says, just downtown, if you go down to the Battery, you can look right across, and there's this beautiful structure. It's the Statue of Liberty. And it's kind of, it was copper colored, but now it's turned to green, and it's up on a big statue, and it's got a pedestal, and it's got this plaque on it, and he told the people what was on the plaque. And now everybody was getting really engrossed with the Statue of Liberty, which was very familiar to them because they lived in New York City. In fact, where I worked, the building I worked in, the Statue of Liberty was just almost just outside the window. I saw it every day. And he stopped his talk and he said, is anybody still thinking about the Eiffel Tower? And they said no. They were thinking about the Statue of Liberty. And his point and my point is, we have the ability to train our mind to keep it off of the things we want, but we have to do that by putting it onto the things that we do want. We can't just say, well, I'm not going to, like Scarlett O'Hara, I'm not going to worry about that today, I'll worry about that tomorrow. It doesn't work. We have to bring our mind to something else. We have to train our mind to stay with something else. So the first thing we want to talk about is awareness. Awareness. And then we are going to talk about the specific practices, the specific techniques that we engage in to change the direction of the energy, of our thoughts, of our attention, of where we are, you know. It's one thing to just say to somebody, well, stop thinking about that. Just don't think about that. Don't worry about that. Just get that off your mind. It's one thing to say that, you know, but if you don't help people understand how to do that, if you don't give them the tools and teach them how to use the tools to do that, you're not making life any better. You're making it worse, because now they're frustrated, as Thich Nhat Hanh said. Now they're frustrated that I failed at happiness. I've tried so hard to be happy, and I'm not happy. I failed at happiness. I failed at everything. You know, I've told you this before, but one time we had a class when we were up at the Durham Church. There was a class, and a lady had read the ad in the newspaper and came to the class. She was not a regular at the church, but she came to this class, whatever it was, I can't remember. And she was very frustrated, you know, and her frustration was real, you know. It was kind of make you sad that she was trying so hard. And she said, I don't know what's wrong. I don't know what's wrong. I have been meditating at 90 miles an hour and nothing is happening. And we chuckled, you know, and she thought we were laughing at her, but we were laughing with her. We've been there. We've done that. You see, you can't force it. You can't struggle with it to end the struggle. You can't, you know. I used to work with a guy who said you can't borrow your way out of debt, you know. And I would say you can't fight your way to peace. You can't struggle to get to that peacefulness. But you have to be able to use the tools you have, which is to pay attention and to change your mind. Can you do those two things? Can you pay attention? Can you change your mind? If you can pay attention, and if you can change your mind, and of course if you have the tools and know how to use them, well then you can move on this path in the pursuit of happiness. So you remember I started this series out a couple of weeks ago, and I have no idea how long it's going to go on, because the pursuit of happiness is something that we can do forever. But I started out talking about the serendipity of things, how out of the chaos all of a sudden something kind of appears. You have all of these different things that seem unrelated, and then suddenly they start to come together. And I mentioned the TV program we were watching, Meeting of Minds, with Steve Allen, where he brought together people in costume and in character from different periods of history, and had them engage in a conversation, you know. And it was interesting in that many of the issues that were going on in Cleopatra's time we're still dealing with today. Humanity hasn't changed very much. Emmett Fox says that as well. He said, we're not far removed from the cave. Getting a drink of water here. He said we can understand the scriptures that were written thousands of years ago because our mindset is not too far removed from the Pharaoh. So Machiavelli was one of the characters, and he said the arguments or the discussions that human beings have are not really solvable. The issues cannot be resolved because we don't even start with a common understanding of the terms. The words come up and somebody says, For example, in today's political environment, somebody will say, our values. And people will get into an argument about our values and never clarify what they mean by that. So I kind of brought that up in the context of, well, what is joy? What is happiness? What is pleasure? All of those things that must be pursued if we are going to come to some understanding of what is happiness. What is this happiness that we're pursuing? But there was another discussion, and Bertrand Russell was a character on there. And I didn't know anything about Bertrand Russell until this program. It was a bit before my time. But the ideas that the character Bertrand Russell was expressing on the show were of interest to me. So I decided to learn a little bit more about what he said. And I found a speech that he gave when he accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1952. And it's very interesting because, to me, in this context of the pursuit of happiness, because he laid out four basic human desires that are of political significance. So he didn't say that they were the only four desires that human beings have. He said, but of political significance. So he gave an example. He said, for example, human beings want to marry. They have the desire to marry. Most people do. He said, but that's not necessarily of political importance. It doesn't affect politicians. It doesn't affect power. It's just something that everybody does. But he said there are four basic desires that kind of appear within the political playground, if you want to think of it that way, or political field. And politicians need to understand them in order to become better leaders, or become more effective leaders. And of course, therein is an issue in itself. When we were listening to some of the talks by the Buddhist monk Matthew Ricard, he said there's two basic motivations. He saw two basic drives. Okay? One was the desire to have more stuff, and the other was to be a better human being. So now we have Russell, who's kind of giving us four, but realizing that there are more than four. And what struck me when I went down this list of four that he gives was two things. One is how prevalent they are in today's society, and number two is how they lead to unhappiness. So the desires that are expressing themselves in the world today, when we look at how they are being expressed, and when we look at the desires themselves, they are desires that lead to unhappiness. But we are not aware of that. We are not paying attention to that. We are just, people are acting and reacting and getting angry and yelling at one another and going on social media and typing nasty comments at one another, you know. And in another video that we watched, I think it was Gurdjieff, he said, you know, people are not awake. They are not awake. They're not aware. They're not paying attention to what's going on. So here are the four desires as Russell gave in this speech, and you can just Google it. You know, Bertrand Russell, four motivations, Nobel speech. It'll pop right up. We're probably going to finish with these for today, and then next week, we will go into the antidotes. You know, what do we do to change that? What do we do to change that? But the first motivation he discussed was the motivation he called acquisitiveness, the desire for stuff, right? Like Matthew Ricard, the desire for stuff. We want to have stuff, we want to have more stuff, and we want to control stuff. Even if we can't have it, we want to control stuff. We can never get enough stuff. And the thing about these four desires that he explained is they can never be satisfied. Never be satisfied. No matter how much stuff you have, there's more stuff. There's more stuff in the world. And we want to have that stuff. And if we look at our culture, if we look at our society, we can see that we are obsessed with getting stuff. I don't know how it is where you live, but around here, the politicians had to pass an ordinance to limit the construction of new self-storage units. Some of the most valuable real estate in town, along the main drags in town, was suddenly popping up in one self-storage unit after another. We as Americans, we have so much stuff that we can't keep it all. We buy houses that are much bigger than we need to live in because we need a place to put our stuff. We have 2-car garages and 3-car garages that we can't get the cars in because they're loaded with stuff. And then we have storage units that we're paying hundreds of dollars a month to keep our stuff in. I was having a conversation with someone one time, and they were complaining how much they were paying every month for their storage units. And I said, well, how much is everything that you have in there worth, you know? And they went down the list, and they said, well, the only things I really need are this, this, and this. And I said, well, if you put a price tag on it, what would they be? And they said, oh, $600. I said, how much you paying a month for the storage units? And they said, $200. I said, so not paying for the storage unit in 3 months, you could go out and buy those things brand new again if you needed them. And here's the key point, is they had this stuff, and it wasn't bringing happiness. It was bringing suffering, mental anxiety. It was bringing suffering, because now they had to worry about paying $200 a month in order to keep their stuff. And what if there was a leak in a storage facility and all that stuff got ruined? Do they need insurance on their stuff? Maybe they don't have insurance, and now they're worried about what happens if there's a leak and then they lose all their stuff. So the Dalai Lama also talks about the difference between pleasure and happiness. And many times the things that we pursue in terms of pleasure wind up causing us unhappiness. So we buy this thing, we buy stuff, and we think that having that stuff is going to bring us a sense of joy, a sense of pleasure. Oh, I'll feel so good when I get this, you know. And then we get it, and we find out that it's bringing us the opposite. Bringing us just the opposite of what we thought. Now it becomes a source of our suffering. We have all this stuff. Now what happens if we lose the stuff? What happens if somebody steals our stuff? Now we got to go put security alarms in. Now we're waking up in the middle of the night when a deer goes through the yard because the cameras are protecting our stuff, you know. And you can see where this desire for acquisitiveness is manifest in our society big time in our society. But it doesn't lead to happiness. It leads to unhappiness. The next desire that he brought out was rivalry. We have to win. We have to win. But not only do we have to win, we have to crush our opponents. And it goes to the extreme. It gets to the point where people don't care if they win or not, as long as their opponent loses. I ran into that in business. I was in customer service for years, and in negotiation you're taught find a win-win proposition and don't negotiate so hard that the opponent is going to be humiliated. You know, give them an opportunity to save grace and all these. I had this one account, and nobody could satisfy this one client, and eventually it got to be mine. And I finally figured out that the only thing that made that customer happy was if they thought I lost. I don't know what it was about them, but that's what it took to make them happy. I could give them everything they wanted, and if I wasn't crushed in the process, if they didn't think they had crushed me in the process, they weren't happy. So I learned how to set things up so that it looked like I was losing when I wasn't. I was in a meeting one time. My big boss was there, and this was going on, and afterwards, the boss says, "Why did you let him do that?" And I said, "Well, that's the only thing that makes him happy. And you told me to come out here and make him happy. So he's only happy if he thinks I lost. So I set things up so he thinks I lost." And the boss says, "Yeah, but all the other people in the room, they thought you lost too." And I said, "They don't mean anything to me. They don't sign my paycheck. You know, I don't care whether they thought I lost or not. What matters is if I get this account turned around." But that was the first time I ran into that. There was somebody who was more interested in me losing than in both of us winning. So this sense of rivalry, and if you look at what's going on in our society today, is, you know, you ask it where our political parties are going. Do they have a vision for making America, you know, a better country, a better place for human beings? Do we have a vision of what the country is becoming? And instead, most of the motivation seems to be just to beat each other down, just to beat each other down. We have to win. We don't care if we lose, but the other guy's got to lose. Right? So this sense of rivalry does not lead to happiness. Because if your idea of happiness, I mean, look at just where we've been in the last 10 or 15 years. If our only sense of winning is or rivalry is that somebody else has to lose, how can we be happy? Because as soon as somebody's not losing, we're unhappy again. And we teach this in our schools from an early age, right? We have the rivalry of school sports, and our kids have to go out and crush the opponents and all these things. And we're teaching them how to be unhappy from the get-go. All right, the next one that he talked about is vanity. Vanity, the ego, puffing up, and we have to have glory, and we have to feel so good about ourselves. And we can see that. We can see how, oh man, especially with social media, and people get on social media and somebody says something they don't like, and now you disrespected me, and now I've got to argue back at you, and you know, there's this Twitter war going on back and forth with people who just want their name out there, you know. Anything that goes on, you'll find people somehow try to attach their name to it. They try to get into it. They want to be vain. And again, it's emptiness. It is emptiness. Because if your motivation is glory and having your name out there and having everybody think wonderful things about you, that can never be, you see. That can never be. You will never satisfy that desire for happiness. The ego desire to be happy. And then the last one that he went into was the love of power. The love of power as a driver in politics. And you can see that. I mean, you can see that there are people who are more interested in holding an office because of the power it wields than they are in actually doing something with it or doing good with it, making the world a better place for people to live. And Russell said something very, very interesting as he was discussing power. He said that one of the things about having power is that you can make people do things they don't want to do because you have power over them. And if anybody else read the book The Magic Christian, we had to read it in high school. But the guy was enormously wealthy, and he used his wealth to humiliate people, you know. Like one example was a policeman was putting a parking ticket on the car. And he went to the policeman. He said, "I'll give you $100 if you eat that ticket." The policeman said, "What?" He said, "I'll give you $200 if you eat that ticket." And he said, "What?" And he eventually got the cop to eat the ticket. Another time he took baskets of $100 bills, and he spread them in like a field of manure, and had people swimming through it to try to get money. Right? Humiliate people, power. And you can see then that what happens is when some people get into positions of power, the way that they know they're in power is to inflict pain on others, to make life miserable for others. Not so much about moving things forward or creating a better place, but just making things miserable for other people. Now he went on to say that all of these desires or all of these motivations don't have to express themselves in a negative way, you know. For example, the love of power could lead for us to want to become better educated, or could lead for us to want to invent something to help the world. But we have to be aware that it is these four desires that seem to be manifesting themselves in the political environment, and they are today just as they were 70 years ago. And he said that they're tainted with the emotions of fear, of anger, and of hatred. So why do people hoard? Well, they're afraid that if I let this go, I'm never going to be able to get it back again. Why do they accumulate stuff, you know? They accumulate stuff because maybe they've lived through a period where they didn't have stuff. You know, you read this about actors or people who become extremely wealthy, but they were poor in their youth. And then like, I think it was a piece I was reading on Anthony Quinn years ago. He never didn't have a house, according to the piece. He didn't have a house to live in when he was a kid, and when he became wealthy, he just bought houses everywhere. He had like 11 or 9 houses all over the world. We tend to accumulate that which we didn't have. So we want to stop at this point for today, and what I'm going to ask you to do is 2 things for the week. And it comes to awareness. So just for this week, if you would just practice awareness. Be aware of what you are thinking and what you are feeling. Right? Remember, I told you Thich Nhat Hanh, they have an app. It's a mindfulness app for your phone, and you can set it to just give a little bell, and you can set the time period: 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever you want. But for the purpose of mindfulness training, the students put this app on their phone, and then you set it so that it makes a noise every, let's say every 30 minutes. And then in that 30 minutes, you just stop and ask yourself, what was I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? And bring your mind back to something you can concentrate on, your breath. As I breathe in, I am aware that I'm breathing in. As I breathe out, I am aware that I'm breathing out. That's it. That's all you have to do for this week. But be aware of how often you are thinking about and feeling things related to these 4 motivations of Bertrand Russell that I've laid out. And is what you are thinking and feeling leading toward happiness or away from happiness? Is it leading towards happiness or away from happiness? You don't need to try to change it yet. We'll go into that a little bit more next week. But it all starts with awareness. It all starts with awareness, you know. What is going on in my consciousness? Because that's the only place that I experience the world, is in my consciousness. What is going on in my consciousness at this moment? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? Is it something that will make me happy or unhappy? Something that leads to happiness or unhappiness? The psychiatrist said to the Dalai Lama, all right, so if people want to be happy, what do? And he says, well, you discover the things that make you unhappy and you stop doing them, and you discover the things that make you happy and you do more of those. Very simple, very simple. But you can't do that if you're not aware. You can't do that if you're not aware. The divine has created us and given us the gift of self-awareness. And I would suggest that most of what's going on in the world today, most of what's going on in the way that the motivations that Bertrand Russell laid them out are being expressed are people who are unaware. Unaware. They are not even aware of what they are doing, much less why they are doing that. Our spiritual growth, our spiritual practice, our path to learning how to be happier people requires us to be aware of what we are doing and to stop doing it. And hopefully we can get insight into why we are doing it. And that insight will help us to remove the root cause. So next week we're going to pick up with part 4. And next week we're going to go into practices that continue the practices of mindfulness to help us to be aware. But then we are going to go into specific practices that we can use to nurture or develop happiness in our lives. There's things that we can do, right? There's things that we've got to stop doing, and we're going to replace those with things that we can do. For this week, just become aware of the things that we ought to stop doing, okay? We'll talk to you all next week. Have a beautiful week, and so it is.